All right, there we go. Hello everyone, how's it going? Team here, and this is BxJS Weekly, episode 85, bringing you all the best JavaScript news of the week in a podcast form. And yeah, we got some pretty intriguing stuff this week around, so let's just get started. Hey Frontend Nexus, welcome to the stream. So as usual, the first section is getting started. We got a couple of articles here this time around. The first one is introducing Sass modules. So Sass actually added proper module support. Like, it had the import clause for quite some time, but it was a bit confusing because import is also a CSS feature, and there was like a bunch of limitations with regards to importing Sass modules. So now you got the use clause that actually works as a proper modules for the Sass, which is quite nice. And if you're using Sass and the feature sounds interesting, then this article is a very good write-up and introduction to it. So do check it out. Hey Bakao, welcome to the stream. All right, continuing, we got 7 simple but tricky JavaScript interview questions. A pretty nice collection of interview questions. I don't really agree that some of them should be in here. Most of them are actually really good. The one that I personally don't like is this eagle eye test, which just basically has a semicolon in a place where it shouldn't be, which, you know, don't write code like this. And then if you use prettier, then it's going to be painfully obvious that this is wrong. But yeah, this is just my nitpick. Basically, this is just not something I think is a good question. But the other ones are actually quite decent. So if you are getting started with JavaScript or you want to check your level of knowledge, then those questions are actually pretty good test, I guess. Okay, continuing, we got React lifting state up is killing your app. A deep dive into the heavily nested states that basically make your app re-render unnecessarily. In this case, it's row cell rendering, as in the first example comes here is the game of tic-tac-toe, right? But then expanding the array and seeing the performance problems with it and how you can exactly battle that. Nothing super complicated, but if you're just getting started with React and you are trying to figure out the way to think about the state, then this is actually a pretty good write-up, so do check it out. Okay. And the last thing we got here is the wondrous world of CSS counters. A really cool write-up about the CSS counters and how they work. I've never heard about this feature. So CSS actually allows you to define custom counters and then to display them in CSS in some way using before, after, or whatever. So you can actually create your own custom lists that will, count stuff, right? So it's not limited to UL or OL tags. You can actually do it with just about anything, including headers, paragraphs, or whatever. And this article shows how to use it and also talks about non-conventional counters and also doing fizzbuzz with it if you if you really like that. So yeah, there you go. If that sounds interesting, do check it out. I mean, I actually found out about CSS counters like 4 weeks ago when we used that feature in our new website. It's pretty interesting that you can actually do that with CSS, but yeah. Okay, so this is it for the getting started section. Now we got the articles and news. We got some very crazy stuff here this time around. So the first one is drawing realistic clouds with CSS and SVG. Now, yeah, this literally the article explains how you can make clouds using a basic CSS and then distorting it with the SVG filters, which is kind of mind-blowing. And there's a lot of most of the article is basically explanation of how exactly that works. But if you're just curious about the results, there's the code pen that shows off the cloud that is essentially just HTML and CSS, and it's 10 lines of code, which is, to be honest, mind-blowing. So if that topic sounds interesting, do check it out. It's quite fascinating what you can actually do with CSS and SVG filters. There is some really cool things here. And then obviously, you can go randomize it with random seeds and stuff. And there is a cloud generator that you can use. This stuff is crazy. It's really great, actually. So do check it out. Okay. Next article we got here is persistent layout patterns in Next.js. A pretty nice write-up on making your website layout persistent and making it load without actually reloading the whole page. This is especially important for building the apps that have nested tabs, for example, in Next.js, because by default it will reload the whole page. So this article talks about how to actually combat this and how do you make sure your app doesn't jump and the loading happens a lot faster than, if you would reload the whole page essentially. If you're working with a complex apps like this and Next.js, then do check this one out. There's more than one approach here, and essentially they all compared against each other, and you probably will find an approach that will work best for your case. There's some very interesting thoughts here, and yeah, it's a really good write-up. Okay, next thing we got here is faster web applications with Vue 3. So this is a pretty nice write-up that explores what's new in Vue.js version 3, outlining how exactly it will, improve performance, make the API tree shakeable, and what other things are changed there. My favorite highlight is probably the proxy-based reactivity. I know that, not all people will like that because you cannot use proxies in older browsers. But the cool thing is that using proxies actually makes for a really incredible performance improvement. So like as you can see here, the basic demo that was shown there for the comparison, rendering 3,000 stateful component instances, gets about double performance improvement. So it's 2x faster than the Vue version 2.5, which is, just by switching to proxies is actually quite impressive. So if you're interested in Vue.js version 3 and you are curious as to exactly what is changed, do make sure to check this one out. Right, that is it for the articles and news. Now we're coming to the tips, tricks, and bit-sized awesomeness. The first thing we got here today is a tiny write-up that is titled Updating Your Website favicon dynamically with dark mode. So if you're trying to make your website dark mode compliant, you know that it might be a bit of a pain in the ass, especially with regards to icon. So sometimes you have the icon that just fits the dark mode, and other times, well, there are some elements that are, like black, for example. Like in this case, his James Ross blog has this JR logo with J being black by default, which means that if you enable dark mode, you cannot really see that J. And the article talks about essentially dynamically swapping the icon by using the dark modes, the watch media query function in JavaScript, and by just dynamically swapping it as soon as the mode switches, which is a pretty nice approach. So if you're working with dark mode, make sure to check this one out. Hey Kepler, welcome to the stream. All right, next thing we got here is announcing Ionic React. So the Ionic now supports React and has a full-on React framework built with it. Again, this is Cordova-based framework. I worked with Cordova back in the days when it was like a standalone thing. I don't even know what the state of it now, to be honest, but I'm not sure why would I pick Cordova-based thing over the React Native at this stage, because I think the React Native approach is like a lot better than Cordova. I guess if you want to have like simplicity of porting your web components to the mobile app, going this way is probably better, but I don't know. Anyway, if you were interested in Ionic but didn't want to go Angular, now you can go with React, and the framework they have actually seems to be quite nice. I mean, the React framework, there's like the router, the default components and stuff like this all included. Seems to be pretty handy actually. So if you are interested, do check it out. All right. Next thing we got here is a couple of RFCs for Next.js. The first one is we're finally getting custom routes in Next.js. So you will be able to do redirects, rewrites, and there's going to be an API for Next routes and related libraries that will basically allow you to, customize the routes in Next.js finally in a way that is flexible and not just depends on your file structure, which is something, for example, Gatsby supported for quite some time, but Next.js didn't. But we're finally getting it, which is kind of great. Yes, it is great. I mean, sometimes you just need this one tiny redirect from one page to another, and with the current version of Next.js, you literally had to add a full-on server with Express just to handle that one redirect, which was annoying as hell, or make a client-side redirect, which is even more ugly. But yeah, so now you'll be able to just do it in a config, which is super handy. So cannot wait for this to basically go live. Probably gonna be in the next major update, but yeah, looks really great. Live quality updates, indeed, yeah. Right, next thing we got here is the new RFC for Next.js for plugins. So we already, Next.js already kind of has plugins, but the idea is to make sort of plugins version 2, I guess, which will be zero config, code splitting built in, and official and community plugin support. So basically the same that we already have for the current version of plugins. I guess the zero config and code splitting built in is the most important bits. Because right now, if you ever try Next.js with plugins, you know that you need to, configure them additionally, which is a bit annoying, basically. But the cool thing is that, yeah, essentially you will be able to just say npm install React DOM next styled components, for example, and you will have Next.js set up with styled components without any additional files. You can just create pages, index.js, and start working, which is actually really awesome. So there you go. If you're interested in the proposals and giving them feedback, make sure to read them and give your feedback if you're heavily involved with these areas of Next.js. I guess, RFCs are there for feedback specifically. So yeah, there we go. Right, next thing we got here is a post from Microsoft team, improving form controls in Microsoft Edge and Chromium. So it's kind of amusing to see that, the ones who are improving Chromium are actually the people from Microsoft, not the Google team. One of the areas that Google Chrome and Chromium team has basically neglected for years have been default controls, right? Stuff like radio buttons, normal buttons, text inputs, password, color selection, matters, progress ranges, date pickers, and all that kind of stuff. It kind of exists. It is there in Chrome and Chromium, right? But it's been there since, I don't even know, like probably version 1, and they haven't changed anything. And some of those controls work terribly on touch screens. Like they're just unusable, basically, right? So one of the aims of the Microsoft guys was to actually make them touch compatible and make them look a bit more modern, within reason, basically. But, I guess the touch priority here comes from the Surface tablets and Surface laptops, which have touch capabilities. And I guess a lot of things nowadays do. So it's kind of nice to see that. Like the time picker especially is a really good improvement in my opinion. So you finally will be able to use a touch here instead of, it's basically wasn't usable before. And there's some, like tiny lift in visuals for stuff like meters, progress ranges, which is just nice to see, I guess. But yeah, it's kind of cool to see that Microsoft is not just, taking Chromium and making Edge base of it, but they are actually contributing a lot back to Chromium, which is really great. There's also some notes on accessibility here and some additional stuff, and they're also requesting feedback. So if you are working a lot with this, make sure to just go and talk to them. Feedback is always great, right? Let me have a look at the chat. It would be nice to see a better way to style form elements. I think the current form elements are stylable enough. Like, what do you think is lacking? I guess the date and time styling is one thing that's completely missing right now, but we're gonna see how that develops. It's definitely true that it would be cool to actually be able to modify them natively, as in without, reinventing your own thing, just maybe color styling or something. But other than that, most of those are pretty flexible in terms of styling, at least. But okay, let us continue. Next thing we got here is Firefox new web inspector. So Firefox finally landed, not web inspector, WebSocket inspector. Firefox finally added WebSocket inspector in the DevTools, something that has been in Chrome for quite some time. But I think the Firefox version is actually quite much more powerful here, because it has a few, let me try that again, a few quality of life improvements that are, I don't think they're actually in Chrome. I haven't worked with WebSockets for quite some time, but I don't remember that you could search across the WebSocket frames. And I also don't remember that you had the proper JSON representation. So this was one of my pain points with Chrome DevTools. While you could look at the raw WebSocket frames, you couldn't actually, if you send JSON there, you couldn't actually properly explore it unless, you just physically copy it, then put it into editor and then format it as JSON, which was annoying. Now, Firefox DevTools actually show you the proper JSON, so you can explore it in place with the whole JSON tree structure and everything, which looks extremely nice. So if you're working with, what is wrong with me today? So if you're working with WebSockets, make sure to check out the new Firefox Developer Edition version 70 that includes these improvements. And yeah, they look pretty damn good. So yeah, it's pretty exciting. All right. Continuing, we got the update to React master branch that migrates the useDeferredValue and useTransition hooks that was behind enable stable concurrent mode API flag. Yeah, so they're basically, it seems like the concurrent mode for React is getting closer to the release, which is something we've been waiting for since the original announcement. When was it? Back in 2018, I think? Like somewhere in the middle of a year whenever they announced the hooks and concurrent mode. And they've been like partially rolling it out over time, and we still don't have like a full-on concurrent mode. So we have the fibers now, but not the concurrent mode. Seems like it's getting closer, so maybe by the end of year we're gonna actually get it. Hopefully, that looks pretty exciting. So yes, data concurrency would be very cool to get in React, and this is another step towards it. So there we go. Okay, next thing we got here, and I think this is the last in tips, tricks, and bit-sized awesomeness, is the intent to experiment from Blink Serial API. So there's an explainer from the Web Incubator group. What is Serial API and why did they decide to go with it instead of going with Web Bluetooth and Web USB, which was different proposals? The gist is that, you know, if you go Web Bluetooth and Web API, it's Web USB, it's actually quite limited, right? Well, just giving a serial access gives you way more flexibility. So it's lower level API essentially. The fact that this exists makes me extremely excited for the web, and I will be very curious to see how exactly this ends up, because I do like the idea that you could have a web app that could basically interface with your hardware, because it brings up some crazy possibilities to web. Obviously, there's like a ton of security concerns, but we're going to see how that develops. That is actually very exciting, and it's like, you know, looking at where the web kind of develops from the, at least from the vendor perspective, like the Google and, you know, Firefox and Microsoft, it seems like at some point it's just gonna straight up replace the desktop apps for, well, okay, obviously not for the old tasks, right? Because there's still some very low level things you can only do on machine. But for the majority of stuff, like your typical CRUD applications, maybe even some basic file editing like VS Code, I can easily see that moving to the cloud as soon as we have all the basic like file system API, and I don't even think it needs a serial API, right? But this is just mind-blowing. Like, and this is really awesome that it exists. In JS we trust. Yes, always bet on JS is, you know, it makes even more sense right now than it did before, to be honest. So there we go. Okay, that is it for the tips and tricks and bit-sized awesomeness. Now we got 2 releases this week. All of them are beta alpha pre-releases. So the first major release is the Webpack version 5 first beta release. So if you are using Webpack, make sure to go and try it out and see the changes and give them the feedback. So, you know, to make sure it actually works properly. There is an outline of new major features and experimental features in the tweet feed. If you're interested, specifically, there's now persistent caching, easier and better long-term caching, improved tree shaking, and reduced runtime. And it also finally no Node.js polyfilling by default. So you no longer will have Node.js polyfills in your bundles by default, and you no longer have to manually disable it, which was extremely annoying when you work with a front-end code. The new experimental features are top-level await, WebAssembly as a sync module, output as module, and asset module type, which is also pretty great. So if you're using Webpack, again, make sure to try it out and give them your feedback. Seems to be pretty cool. Again, you know, like Webpack got so complex that there was a joke recently on Twitter, I don't remember from whom I saw it, but it was like, I am now a junior Webpack engineer in our company because basically all my work is writing Webpack configs, which, you know, doesn't actually seem that far from truth because Webpack configs are damn complex. If you don't like damn complex Webpack configs, I got good news for you. Parcel 2 is now Alpha 2, With less Sass, Pug, and more plugins, it now supports Babel config.js, supports inline scripts and styles, faster cached builds, and a bunch of other stuff. So if you're interested in Parcel, make sure to try it out with Parcel at Next and give them your feedback as usual. So yeah, this is basically it for the releases. Just 2 of them this week around. Not sure what's happening here, but yeah. Now we got libraries and demos here. What is wrong with my tongue today? It just doesn't want to talk. So now we got the libraries and demos. And the first thing we got here today is React Pager. It's a simple React Pager component that also supports gestures and has API for switching pages programmatically if you want to. Looks really nice. So if you're looking for the paging component, do check it out. It actually seems pretty solid. Next thing we got here is AntMotion. At least I think that's what it's called, because it is open source on the GitHub. You can actually see the parts of it, at least on the GitHub. It allows you to use the Ant design framework in React to build your app, but use it, do it like drag and drop ways. You can actually drag and drop those components over here and then just go ahead and edit text as hello world, for example, right? And then you can either preview that right here in place, which is just really cool, or you can publish it directly to the cloud, or you can download it and, you know, continue working with it locally, which is actually really, really nice layouting and editing tool. There's also like a ton of features that it supports, including CSS editing, and it's just crazy. So yeah, I guess if you're using AntDesign, this is really good news for you. Make sure to check this one out. It's actually quite damn cool. All right. Continuing, we got Library-Detector-for-Chrome, an extension that detects JavaScript libraries that are running on the page. So if you're curious as to what your favorite website is using, or maybe you wanted to know how exactly you could detect libraries on the websites, do check this one out. It's very straightforward. It's open source. It's also really old. Like one of the first commits is like almost 10 years ago, to be honest. So yeah, there you go. Okay, next thing we got here is bullshit.js, a bookmarklet for translating marketing speak into human readable text. Basically what it does is just replaces all the hype words like best of breed, mission critical, enterprise into bullshit. And it's really fun to just go ahead and try that on pages for stuff like, from companies like Oracle or Apple or Microsoft or Google. A lot of them have bullshit marketing speak. So the bookmarklet itself is super straightforward, and there's like a dictionary if you want to contribute back. It is very silly, but very amusing to actually see that in action. Right, continuing, we got Woah.css, an animations for eccentric developers. So this is a set of absolutely bonkers animations that, I mean, I guess you can use them on your website, but this is not even the worst one. So my favorite one is the, where is it? Is the Fedora tip. There you go. It's literally adds the Fedora to your div and it tips it, and then Fedora goes away. That's all you have to know about this library. So if that sounds interesting, do check it out. Next thing we got here is dial, a rotary dial menu for numbers. So this is literally like a rotary dial that you can use to input numbers for some reason. Again, I don't know why would you use that on your website, but if you do want to use it, do check it out. It's built using Canvas.js, the Canvas, obviously, and some JavaScript. Pretty straightforward, also customizable, so you can actually tweak the colors. And yeah, it works. All right, next thing we got here is painterro, I guess, is how you read it, a JavaScript painting plugin. So this is essentially a full-on editor that allows you to paint over images or, paint over whiteboard if you want to, and then cut and crop and modify that, and has like figures and stuff and brushes. It's not, it's not extremely complex, but it's basically like a paint, right? And it seems canvas based, so you can't exactly modify what you did. I think it does support Control-Z, but that's about it. Looks quite nice, so I guess if you wanted to modify images, this is probably the way to go. Okay, continuing, we got coolgrid, ultra flexible and extensible grid system for React based on style components and heavily inspired by Bootstrap grid system. So this is, just as it says, a React-based grid system that you can just use by using components. I personally always prefer to use some sort of a CSS framework. Lately, there's been Tailwind just because of how flexible it is, but maybe you prefer using components for grids, then do check this one out. It's actually very tiny and very nicely built. All right, next thing we got here is typical. Animated typing in just 400 bytes of JavaScript. So if you wanted to do typing animations, as in, you know, when someone types on your website for whatever reason, then you can do that in just 400 bytes of TypeScript. And it's literally as easy as just calling a function on your target, which seems quite nice. All right. Next thing we got here is noise to scroll. This is probably one of my favorite ones this week around. This is literally allows you to scream at the screen for scrolling the content. So you know, we have this very long div, and then you click to start. It says, okay, allow the microphone. And now I can just talk here and it will scroll the div for me, but I have to talk really loud, otherwise it won't scroll. So yeah, it literally makes you scream at the screen for scrolling the content. I don't know why you would want that, but maybe you do, so there you go. Next thing we got here is tspvis, a really cool visualization of algorithms for solving the traveling salesman problem. It's also completely open source, so if you were exploring what is the traveling salesman problem and how exactly you can solve it, this is a really, really cool visualization. So it's live on the tspvis.com if you want to try it. You can also check out the source code. Let me just permit this stuff here. It is an amazing visualization. So like there's basically all the algorithms for solving the problem, and you can look at them with different delays, step by step, and so on and so forth. It is mind-blowingly cool. So if you have any interest in basically solving problems like this and figuring out how do they actually algorithms work visually, make sure to check this one out. It is actually very impressive. All right. Continuing, we got human signals, a really nice library for human-friendly process signals. So if you ever try to work with Node.js and process signals, you know that you typically get either a number or a code, which is then you have to go into manual and look up what the hell is that and what does it mean. Well, this library does it for you. Essentially gives you the name, number, description, supported, action, forced, and standard names for it, basically. So you can easily look up whatever you want about the specific process code in a matter of seconds by just looking it up from this library instead of going into manual, which can be quite handy. Right, next thing we got here is Benny, a dead simple benchmarking framework for JavaScript and TypeScript libs. A really nice looking benchmarking framework that essentially allows you to set up test cases with whatever many cases you want, essentially testing stuff that will do the multiple benchmarks for you, do the averages, calculate the errors, and so on and so forth for you. And you just basically do a very basic setup and you are done. So if you're doing a lot of benchmarking and you wanted to simplify it, I guess, do check this one out. It seems to be quite nice. Next thing we got here is dexie.js, a minimalistic wrapper for IndexedDB, a very nice looking wrapper that works with IndexedDB just as it says, that has an API that is very similar to MongoDB, I guess. The cool thing about that, I mean, I think this library has actually been around for quite some time. The problem being that is IndexedDB wasn't actually supported in Internet Explorer, but now that we are getting, where's my can I use website? Now that we are getting, let me just type it. There we go. Now that we are getting Edge based on Chromium, it's finally not going to be a problem anymore, at least for the evergreen browsers, right? And you can finally use it in your websites without a fear of being, well, basically not being able to use it. So there we go. All right, next thing we got here is Azula or Azula. I'm not sure how exactly to pronounce it. It's a really neat library, lightweight GPU accelerated HTML UIs for native JavaScript. So the way it's built is actually, it has the base C++ code, right, that uses GPU context to render your HTML into a native UI, which is just crazy. basically the way it does it allows you to go and to use very little CPU, very little RAM, and very little disk. So the disk size is basically just the slim GPU wrapper that was written along with the JavaScript engine, right? It only works for Windows now because, you know, you have to actually write the C code to make it work on other platforms, and writing C code that is cross-platform is quite an endeavor, but it is actually pretty interesting. So if that sounds interesting, do check it out. It seems like a pretty exciting project, at least to keep an eye on. Okay. Yeah, we got 0 things. So okay, this is another insane project we got this week. It's a 3D graphics rendering pipeline that is implemented in JavaScript and runs entirely in your terminal. So you can take a 3D graphics scene and then render it in terminal using ASCII symbols. So what you see here is a terminal, and all of that stuff, this is rendering some 3D scene, right? I'm not sure what exactly is it rendered, but it renders it using ASCII symbols in your terminal, and it doesn't require GPU, which is, I mean, I guess there are some use cases for that, but this is just bonkers. So if that sounds interesting, do check it out. It's nonetheless, you know, like if you're working with graphics and we're curious as to how you implement the 3D rendering pipelines, this might be a really good studying material. Okay, that is actually it for the libraries and demos. I got some interesting and silly stuff for you today. So the first here is the announcement from archive.org. They have added 2,500 more MS-DOS games that are now playable at archive.org. The cool thing about it, why am I highlighting this, is because, well, first of all, because I love games. I don't think that's a secret. Second of all, because those are MS-DOS games and they are now working in your browser using the WebAssembly and the DOS simulator. I forgot the name of it. God damn it. What was the name of it? DOSBox, there we go. This is what I want to say. So yes, you can now run DOSBox along with the DOS games right in your browser using WebAssembly and play all of those really cool old games like Street Rod Digger and a bunch, like, yeah, there's a ton of them. Some of them are actually really damn big. Like there are some games that are like half gig in size you have to download before actually running it. But if that sounds interesting, do check it out. There's definitely, like, the catalog is insanely large. There is a ton of cool stuff. Like, you can play Wipeout. You can just go ahead and play Wipeout in your browser. All right, next game we have here is a bit more complicated. It's an SQL Murder Mystery. So it is your typical murder mystery game, but to solve it, you actually have to use SQL to query the bunch of tables that have data about events, crimes, people, income, solutions, and so on and so forth. So if you are working with SQL and you wanted to check your knowledge, or maybe you're learning it and you want to know more, do check this one out. It's a really neat one. I think it took me a few hours to actually get through it because I'm terrible at SQL apparently, but it's a really fun one. Okay, and the last thing to close this off we got here today is how-to-exit-vim. This is simple methods for exiting Vim, as the repository says, and this is probably the best laugh I had all the week. So there is, yeah, there's just there is just some crazy stuff in here. My favorite way is probably the experienced, what was it? Experienced, the product, yeah, the experienced product manager way and the product manager way. Those things are just read through it, okay? So some of those ways are just crazy. The coolest one that I found that was like made me lol really hard was the timeout way. Like set a timeout before starting Vim, and then it's gonna close on a timeout, so you have exactly like 2 minutes to work with the file, which is, I mean, it's extremely stupid, extremely silly, and very fun. Okay, that is basically it from my side. So if you guys have any questions or suggestions, feel free to throw them into the chat right now. If not, we can just wrap it up here. For whatever reason, the last few episodes has been just about half an hour long. I guess there's not that many things happening in JavaScript worlds right now, but yeah. Okay, meanwhile, while you're thinking about the questions and suggestions, I am just gonna say that, as usual, you can find all the mentioned links on the GitHub or on bxjs.dev. can join our Discord server to discuss any of that or just talk about video games. There's also a Telegram channel that includes all the raw, unfiltered links that I collect over the week. And you can follow me on Twitter to see the announcement for the dev streams or BxJS Weekly streams. That's basically it. Seems like my link didn't qualify for the podcast. Oh yeah, you shared the React charts link. I originally included it, but then I noticed that it basically no longer maintained, and the original author is looking for the like the other maintainers. So I decided to not include it here for this reason, essentially because it's, kind of not exactly safe to recommend unmaintained library. This was my reasoning at least. But if someone picks it up and maintains it again, I will be more than happy to cover it, because the library itself actually looks pretty good. It's just that it hasn't been updated in quite some time now. Okay. Any more questions, suggestions, or other stuff? Yes, it's on a maintenance mod, and I mean, it's just like, I don't know. I don't think it's a good idea to include libraries that are no longer supported into the podcast and sharing it with everyone. It's just basically my reasoning behind it. More gaming. I will do a gaming stream tomorrow. I picked up the Disco Elysium, that is the detective RPG thing that looks absolutely bonkers, and I'm gonna stream it tomorrow. So stay tuned. All right. Any more questions, suggestions? If not, we can just wrap it up here and go do something. Yes, I did finish Darksiders 3. That is not related to JavaScript. I think you already asked me on the Discord, if I remember correctly, but I did finish it. Okay, well, doesn't seem like there's any more questions or suggestions, so thank you very much for watching. If you missed the podcast, it's going to be available as a VOD immediately on Twitch and a few hours on YouTube. So thank you guys very much for watching. Thank you for your continued support, and I see you next time. Bye!